Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm speaking to someone who has had a fascinating career path that I think we can learn some really interesting lessons from. Sarah Ward began working in chemistry, became a regulator, and then responsible for governance at the Bank of England, where I worked with her. And now she's changed to do something which seems entirely different, but as you'll hear, makes perfect sense. Because Sarah now runs the Cookery Lab, a cookery school that uses a science-led approach to teach people how to cook with confidence. What makes her work compelling is that she's not training professional chefs. Instead, she's helping everyday people to rethink their approach to food. For Sarah, cooking isn't just about following a recipe, it's about understanding the science behind it, the structure that holds it together, and the creativity that makes it so enjoyable. In our conversation, we explore how her background in chemistry informs her teaching style, and how her governance experience at the Bank of England has shaped her views on structure, management, and risk in both boardrooms and kitchens. We talk about why she believes cooking is a life skill everyone should learn, how she helps people overcome their fear of the kitchen, and the surprising parallels she's discovered between governance and gastronomy. So whether you're someone who loves to cook or someone who avoids it at all costs, there's plenty to learn from Sarah's journey and her perspective on how understanding the basics can unlock confidence in any part of life. I really enjoyed recording this and I think you're going to find it fascinating. It's my discussion with Sarah Ward on chemistry, committees and cooking. Welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
I am really excited to have you because you and I haven't seen each other or spoken for some time. And where we got to know each other was we were working, literally defining governance at the Bank of England. And we'll come on and talk about how that's taken you to where you are now. But let's talk about what it is that you're doing now.
Yeah, I think it's been about 12 years. So it does feel like a long time. So it feels strange to say it, but I'm going to be bold and say that these days I'm a chef and I'm the owner of a cookery school. It's called the Cookery Lab. It looks a bit like a chemistry classroom. In fact, it's complete with school lab chairs and beakers and test tubes and conical flasks and all those things you'd more often find in a chemistry lab. And I've just been open for about 6 months. So it's been a real complete life shift for me.
Amazing. And so the idea is that people come and have a fun experience and not necessarily learn how to cook in the sense of it being a cordon bleu cookery school, but this is to come and sort of just enjoy cooking. Is that right?
Exactly. So I think, there are plenty of amazing cookery schools who are teaching people to be chefs. I'm definitely not doing chef training, but really it is about the enjoyment of cookery. So I think all of us have to cook, or most of us have to cook unless we have someone at home who is enjoying doing it for us. But at some point in our lives, when we leave home or find ourselves on our own, we have to cook. And I think that lots of people struggle with cooking and struggle with the enjoyment. And actually, I think that if you are a bit more confident in the kitchen, my view is that you can enjoy it. It doesn't mean that you have to be a master chef, but I think there is some enjoyment to be found in making something that you enjoy eating. So that's more what it's about.
I love this because on the one hand, cooking is a skill that everybody needs to have, right? Because ultimately, you need to have somebody that can cook for you, right? It's a thing we all need. And yet it's missing from many people's educations and experiences. And there's always strikes me there's a sort of interesting divide out there, and this is very loosely defined, of there are the people that can and the people that can't, right? And there are people that proudly cook, and then there's the people that go, I can't really do that. Almost like playing a musical instrument or those sorts of things. And so I think it's really interesting that you've tapped into something that on the one hand, you would think this would be something we'd all be taught at school or would all have picked up, but clearly some people haven't. And you're kind of plugging that gap and bringing some joy to that as well.
Yeah, so I think that I don't think the school food curriculum has changed since I was at school, which is a long time ago now. And I think children are a bit turned off by what they're learning at school. But I think some places are doing amazing things. There's a huge movement now in school food and in trying to kind of teach more interesting school food and feed, in fact, the school lunches. But there's also lots of places where they don't have that kind of blessing. And so actually, the way I got into teaching cookery was that at my son's primary school, they sent out a note to parents saying, we have this teaching kitchen facility, but we don't have anyone who's able to teach cookery. Are there any parents who are happy to come in for a couple of hours and teach? And I was so excited. I emailed back and said, well, actually, I'm a chef. I've worked in some restaurants and I would love to come in. And they bit my hand off. And that was the moment where, for me, I did it as part of a sort of community work in around my kind of full-time job, but it quickly became just my most favorite part of the week. Here I was cooking with 10-year-olds who were making super simple recipes like bread rolls, but for the majority of them, they'd done no cooking whatsoever. And suddenly they were taking this very messy bowl of, shaggy flour and water and yeast and turning it into an actual bread roll. And the look on their face was something that, I couldn't get anywhere else in the rest of my kind of working life. It was a very different feeling of satisfaction.
Wow. So this is totally serendipitous. So you clearly enjoy cooking, and without that, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think so. It's funny, isn't it? I had for years before that the kind of path from corporate career to kind of being a chef wasn't a quick one, and maybe we can chat about that. But I think that moment, was actually very, very pivotal. So I'd thought for a long time, what would I like to do? Seen lots of restaurants I'd like to work in, or who would I like to work for? But teaching cookery wasn't something just until that very innocent email. So yes, I guess that did really change my life.
I love that. That's just literally one of those sort of sliding doors moments. And we talk a lot about, the principle of it, but I love the fact that it happened in such a kind of innocent and authentic way. And I love the way you talked about it, which was just grabbing the opportunity, right? You sort of like it's there and immediately that that's what you should be doing.
Yes, it just seemed kind of, too fun. Sometimes when you're a parent at a primary school, you get asked to do all sorts of things that you think, oh gosh, I don't want to man the car park. I don't want to run the sweet stall. But the cookery felt like, oh, okay, I can put my hand up for something that I think I can do and also that I might enjoy. But certainly, even then, I didn't anticipate how much I would enjoy it.
So I just love this because it's just clear from the way you talk about it, right? That there's just this. And it's interesting in that context because there's a childlike enthusiasm in the way that you talk about this, right? Is it clearly you're very excited about it, and that is, and we'll come on and explore that. That is what allows you to have the idea of setting this up as a business to become your full-time thing. But you're like, there's just this intrinsic motivation to do this. You're not just saying I can do this. You're embracing this wholeheartedly, just going, yeah, this is me.
Yeah, I think it's very perceptive of you. I think this is definitely 10-year-old Sarah, kind of pre any sort of, I guess, preconceived ideas about what I should be or what I should do in that slightly innocent moment of finding out about what people did for jobs. In fact, probably very strangely, I think my passion for working in food came from a school project we did when I was 10, where we had a teacher who set up a kind of project for a term where, as a class, we had to run a sandwich shop. So it was everything from kind of coming up with the concept of what sandwiches we would sell to going on a field trip to a supermarket to learn how they kind of deal with supply and demand, to then having a day where we made sandwiches and then we sold sandwiches in the school. And to me, I guess it was everything from the excitement of doing something a bit different and just it was fun. Running a business was fun. And I don't think I'd had anything kind of similar in terms of experiences. It just felt like, gosh, there's something after school which could be, really exciting out there for me.
And so, like most of us, that's there. But lots of people don't unleash it. And clearly we all go off and do sensible things, right? We sort of stop pursuing that. There are people I know that have just managed to see it through. And I guess it's sort of easier if you've always wanted to be a doctor or something like that, right? Because the path is obvious and it's sensible. When your interest or your passion, let's call it what it is, right, is something that's that sort of comes with, is perceived to have a load of risk that hasn't necessarily been done before in that way, or if it has, is viewed as, that's a dangerous career to go. Why would you want to do that type thing? You go off and do something sensible. And I love that you've identified that childhood moment, because I think that's sort of key, because that's your North Star, I guess, right, for doing what you do.
Yeah. I mean, part of me would still love to run a sandwich shop. I don't think that's the evolution, but that is still there. Yeah, absolutely. Or the feeling that gave me, definitely.
And the other thing that struck me is, as you were talking, it really struck me, is that's what The Apprentice ought to be, right? It ought to be showing the TV show, is showing people about businesses and how it works, as opposed to what we get, which is this kind of stuff, this game show. And so I love all credit to the teacher that did that in the first place, right? Because it clearly instilled something in you that goes way beyond teaching you the economics or the not necessarily even using those terms, right? But gave you something really fundamental. And that seems to me that's what teaching should be about. Right? It's like yes, there's a syllabus and things you need to know, but it's lighting that kind of inspiring you, lighting that spark.
Yeah, definitely. Sadly, I couldn't remember who the teacher is, so not able to thank them. But yeah, definitely. I think it probably was a very unconventional thing to do, and who knows what their colleagues thought of the approach. But yeah, definitely, it made a big impact on me.
And so, had you been kind of nurturing this idea as you went and did other things in your life, or was it? I mean, so were you conscious of the fact this memory was there, or did this memory only reappear once you sort of found yourself with this unique serendipitous moment where it could kind of appear?
I mean, I think the honest answer to the question is probably if anyone had asked me at any point, about nice memories about school, it was always there as a kind of nice memory. I grew up in a very tiny New Forestish place and, went to a very standard state school. There wasn't anything special about that. But it was, I had a nice childhood and a lovely family and those sorts of things. So it would have popped out then. But I think the sensible word that you used earlier is probably the most important one in my mind and thinking about what I should do. I don't think it was in any way pressure from my parents or others or anything to do something particular. But, I have an amazing kind of older sister and older brother, and they both went off to university and were very impressive and did amazing things. And I guess as the youngest, you sort of look to that kind of example and think, oh gosh, I should, also be doing those things. I think, I was definitely having questions in my mind before I went off to university about, is this the right thing for me? But somehow, so I studied chemistry, and really that's as close to cooking as you could get. It was basically mixing ingredients in a recipe and then writing about it and watching whether it goes wrong or right. Not often very edible at the end. But I think for me, I loved science. I mean, I loved chemistry, and still do. And so it wasn't a kind of poor man's choice. I wasn't choosing something kind of a lesser option. It was just this excited me, and I suspect the same reasons that I like cookery are the ones that I like chemistry.
How did you go from chemistry to doing where we met, where, as I say, it's a very simple term, sort of governance of the Bank of England. So running the regulator behind the scenes, doing all the sort of those very sort of organized, uncreative environment, you might say. How did you go from chemistry to that?
Yeah. So, I studied chemistry, and I did a 4-year kind of initial degree, which had a year in industry. I went and worked in pharmaceutical research for the 3rd year of my degree, and I just loved it. I loved the world of work. Maybe that sounds a bit now, but I just loved it. And for me, I think the most important thing that came out of that experience was that I loved being in the lab. I loved the research, but I looked to my kind of manager at the pharmaceutical company, who's a brilliant, brilliant man. But his job was essentially to sit in an office. I mean, very busy and important job, and he was great. But I thought, gosh, how boring. I know, ironic given where we met.
I'm kidding. We're going to get to the story, but yeah.
But I thought, oh gosh, I don't want to be a manager. I want to be doing something. And I think that's that creative part of me. So I went back to uni for the 4th year and thought, oh gosh, I just don't think pharmaceuticals is the right thing for me, because if I make progression in my career, I'll get stuck in an office. And I thought, oh, I need to do something a bit different. And I then ended up doing some really kind of different kind of research with a great kind of research group, which then meant I ended up doing a second master's at a different university. I went up to Newcastle, and that was amazing. And I was all thinking about doing a PhD, and maybe I'm going to, end up kind of specializing in chemometrics, which was what I was doing, a lot of sort of analyzing chemical data. And then I just thought, oh gosh, I've been at uni for 5 years, and actually I need to get a job. And suddenly I found myself working for large pest control and hygiene company, and I was kind of doing analytical chemistry for them, and was actually in the position as a regulated firm. So I was working on kind of applications to our kind of chemical regulator, and I remember one time kind of flying off on a trip to Portugal to visit our European chemical regulator and thinking about how fascinating the world of regulation was. However, again, odd that may sound to your listeners, but I was excited by it, and I was interested by the rules and how, we were kind of applying and what we were doing. And then it actually, again, just a very strange moment, the New Scientist magazine, the Financial Services Authority had placed an advert in the New Scientist magazine for financial supervisors. And I thought to myself, oh, I could move to London. My brother and sister both lived in London. I thought, maybe this would be exciting. And maybe this was a way of kind of getting into regulation. So yeah, it was as simple as a random job advert that I saw one day whilst I was eating my lunch. And I thought, well, maybe I could do this. They're looking for scientists, and I don't know anything about finance, but it says they'll teach me.
That's quite intriguing because there's obviously sort of an in joke that you could make about the FSA in the UK used to be the Financial Services Authority or the Food Standards Agency, right? So there's a sort of like joke in the offing there that you went to the wrong FSA, but that's quite an interesting thing. Putting in, I always find it intriguing when I see moments of regulatory innovation and creativity, and you would think, well, actually, putting an ad in something that's going to be read by scientists is kind of forward thinking, right? That's a really smart way to look and get different minds on the case, that people that might, you're being a good example, right? Somebody that wouldn't naturally follow this course. So I love that. So whoever did that, right? Really inspired place to put an ad, because it's not the obvious place to put them.
And it was quite controversial, but that's it. They did term it sort of an innovative recruitment campaign. And the reason behind it was they wanted people who'd either done a master's or done a PhD. And they wanted people that could write. And they felt that teaching people the soft skills of being able to write and communicate well were more challenging than teaching people about kind of financial products and risk and those sorts of things. So they kind of said to themselves, look, actually, let's draft in some people who are good at those things, and let's teach them everything we think they need to know. And, I won't mention any names, but there are some kind of very successful people from that campaign who've gone on to be kind of very large and senior figures in financial firms. So, they definitely had something in that. I think quite a few people were recruited through that lens.
I love that idea. The writing thing that makes sense to me. But there's a sort of, I can see the experimental nature of science and the research and development side. Stuff might go wrong.
Yeah.
You could say primitive analysis. You would sort of go, that seems very at odds with an organization that's there to make sure things don't go wrong. Right. So I'm struck by that tension, and I think it's resolvable, but I'm just intrigued on your thoughts on those things, because you could sort of go like, and I know there are rules about laboratory. You can't just do what the hell you want in a lab. I understand that. But conceptually, right, the reason you conduct experiments is you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, right? You can predict certain things. And that's why research is interesting, because you will discover things that we didn't know before. And if I sort of looked at that in the context of regulation, certainly historic logic would be, well, we don't want that. We don't want regulators that are experimenting with stuff, because they're there to make sure everything runs according to plan.
Totally. Look, I agree with you, but I think for me, it was about putting yourself in the mind of the people you are regulating. So the reality is that I would say not all, but some firms are experimenting with how far can they push it? Where can they go? What can they do that's different? How can they get a competitive advantage? How can they kind of turn the dial within the boundaries of the rules to get as close as they feel like they need to make profit, or for whatever purpose. And I think for me, it was quite eye-opening. I started thinking, oh gosh, I don't know anything about this, and realized quite quickly that it was really about researching everything. So I used to love it. I spent some time as a supervisor, and when you would get the enormous packs of information, which I'm sure maybe wasn't your favorite thing, but you'd get the enormous packs of information from the firms. I actually loved that, because I often would think, oh gosh, they've sent 5 lever arch files. And I think some of the firms I supervised assumed that you wouldn't read it. And then they all gave you more information as a slightly baffling way. But for me, that information was power, because if I read everything they'd given me, then I would have a huge amount of information when I was planning, to interview and those sorts of things. And actually, I quickly realized that board minutes, I think that's where it changed for me. Board meetings, committee meetings, minutes, things that other people thought were boring were actually really interesting. You could see, which of your non-executives is challenging something, what's being discussed, what's not being discussed. Why haven't they talked about this project that they're working on? Or have they talked about it and they've not written it down? And I think that's where my interest in governance started, was reading endless board meeting minutes and seeing how very differently different people did it.
I love that. And as you were talking, I was giggling because I read the dynamic of kind of what you might term flooding the channels. When continuing the analogy is that, so the idea simply being that if there's something I don't want you to spot, but I have to disclose it to you, right? I'll disclose a whole load of other things in the hope that you haven't poured through the detail. And I think you make a really good point that, some of the most effective regulatory interactions I ever had was because, and you were spot on with your analysis, right? I'm not going to read that stuff, right? That's not my thing, but I want somebody on the team that has. I want somebody on the team that goes, let's look at that. We should press this button here. And they've done the kind of detective work to find that stuff out. And you're absolutely right. Is if you discover those things, you've kind of, and I think board meetings is an interesting one. Board minutes rather is an interesting one because you're looking at an official record, and you hinted at this, which is sort of like the official record doesn't necessarily reflect reality.
Exactly.
It is what you would like reality to be. So often you will get minutes that reflect the conversation they should have had, and particularly in a regulated environment where those things are going to be subject to scrutiny, you're sort of quite performative.
Yeah.
And so there's this substance versus form in some respects, right? It's sort of like, what does this look like? Does this look good? And you get sort of exam answer board minutes. And so I love this idea that you kind of recognize that and go on, so you're looking at it, from what you were saying, you're looking at it from both sides, right? Which is sort of like, does this pass the exam question? Does this look sensible? Right. Have they understood the performative element of minutes? But also you can start to go, well, hold on a minute, let's dig at the substance here, because why haven't they talked about something? So you're kind of looking at it both ways as a sort of like reflection of reality, but also a reflection of what they would like reality to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, it just opened my eyes, I guess, to a slightly different world. And so I kind of spent time supervising. I went off and did a really interesting secondment for a year to the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and that was completely different again. I had a real interest in financial crime and how that works. And then I came back and I found myself as an insurance supervisor, and it was the start of Solvency II the first time round. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I didn't really want to supervise Solvency II.
Do you want to explain for people that don't? And probably for my benefit as much as anyone else, just give us a quick summary. What is Solvency II? Because I always love it with regulations where you get two, like the sort of sequel to a movie. So you love Solvency I, have Solvency II, but just give us a quick summary as to what that is for anybody that's confused.
It makes it sound very exciting, doesn't it? So essentially, a European directive that was supposed to kind of harmonise insurance regulation across the EU. So there was a Solvency I regime, but this was 2010 when I was an insurance supervisor, and it was sort of being thought about then. But actually, the final framework didn't come into effect till 2016. So I jumped out of that particular role a lot earlier. And amusingly, in my governance role, spent a long time taking minutes of meetings that related to insurance regulation. I think it was just a moment where I thought, I love supervision, but actually this isn't for me. I didn't kind of feel like it was the kind of actuarial nature of insurance supervision, just wasn't something that I was as excited about. And a job came up in the CEO's office, looking at kind of committees and governance of committees at the FSA. And so for me, I thought, well, that's an interesting moment to kind of do something that I've been interested about in firms and see what it's like in my own organisation. And so it was a strange shift, but I became responsible for the committees that were looking after supervision. So, in that sense, it felt very comfortable and was very interesting.
And I think that's a really interesting shift, because often you get people who are responsible for doing things that haven't got the sort of
supervisory mindset. So if you're in a regulated industry, you might have no idea why are they asking these questions, where they're coming from. But you've done the interesting thing where you know what this stuff is about, and you go from being in the nicest possible sense, from a reviewer to a producer of these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it made a massive difference to being able to do that job well, to kind of understanding the topics that were being discussed. I think, it's all well and good. People say in an organization that, minute takers are the most junior people. Well, actually, taking a good set of minutes, I think, is an incredibly hard job. And I have a huge amount of respect for people that do it, especially under conditions where people don't really respect that, that's an important job. And so for me, kind of understanding what was happening in the room and kind of being able to kind of make connections in my brain with what might happen next meant that it became a really interesting job.
And it's really strange, that dynamic you've talked about, because you're right. It's sort of like, here's a menial task. I'm above that, or I'm going to give it to a junior person.
Yeah.
Right, sort of, and it's often cloaked in the sort of, well, it'd be a good development opportunity for them to come along and see how an adult meeting is run, right? So and that's true, right? There is some benefit to seeing how these things operate, because if you've never been in that environment, you don't necessarily know how they operate. So there is a benefit to that. But you're right, it sort of gets piled on people. And you kind of, I always thought it was interesting when you put a junior person in a meeting that they wouldn't normally have any experience of being in. How are they supposed to know exactly what's important and what's not? And so this whole exercise, the rationale that you've explained there about this becomes the evidence, the track record, the history of what was discussed. Putting someone who's not really in a position to work out, and that's everything from the politics to the significance to the whatever to the how to diplomatically describe things.
Yeah.
Of course, they're not going to be able to do that because they've never been in that position. And I always thought it was hanging junior people out to dry in some cases, where you send them in a meeting that is not an environment they're familiar with. And if it's not an environment you're familiar with, and you're spending half your time sort of, who are these people? What's going on? Like, what have they just said? And you're not in a position to sort of intervene if you're too junior, to go, can you just repeat that? Or have I got this right? Because you're just the note taker. Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting illustration there of a sort of laziness stroke misunderstanding of the nature of the diet, not thinking it through from a human perspective as much as an administrative one.
No, totally. And I think the thing that people don't necessarily understand is that, I've been in some incredibly exciting meetings. I have, like, super private things. It was a really fascinating time, in the kind of 2010s, shall we say, of things that were happening in the kind of financial sector. And I have kind of had a first-hand seat at some amazing decisions. And that I always thought was a privilege. For me, it was a bit like, I love singing, and I used to sing with the London Symphony Chorus. And I always used to say that my favorite thing was, it was like having a free seat at a concert, because when you sit with the choir, you're facing the conductor. And I always used to think the most exciting thing is watching the conductor and what they do and how they get that orchestra and then that chorus to kind of perform, and how they can bring their own kind of expression to that music. And so for me, it was a really similar thing, like watching a committee or board make a really important decision. It's that kind of first-hand observation that most other people who read about it aren't ever going to get. They're not going to experience that kind of moment. And I think that's the thing I loved about it.
And I think there's something really cool about being, to use the Hamilton phrase, in the room where it happens, and having it spoiled, but with the pressure taken off you that you're not necessarily, you're not participating in that decision making, and yet you have to be connected to it and know what's going on. So it's a very unique set of circumstances. And having said you're not participating, you kind of are, for the reasons that you've outlined, because you are writing the record of it. You're to some extent, you're putting your own stamp on the history that comes out of that room, even if you're not participating in the discussion.
Yeah, that sounds more scary. I think if you'd said that to me at the time, Christian, I might have been a bit more apprehensive. But yeah, I think totally with hindsight, I can say that. And sometimes it probably felt that. There were some rooms I walked out of and I knew that what I'd written was significant, not in any way because it was my words, but, just because I had, summarized that. And that was, that was interesting, but the side effects or the impact of that is you can't talk about it, so you don't sort of come out of the room and go, oh, guess what I did today. think anyone in my life would have been like, Sarah, that's so boring. Really. As you say, my ability to be excited about things which others might find dull is possibly my superpower.
I'm struck as we're sort of thinking about this. Obviously the tendency nowadays is to record stuff, right? Because it's easy to do.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think is interesting is when we look at, what is and isn't recorded, and we've seen this in politics recently with people using unofficial channels, we get sort of, illicit recordings of things. And there's a really interesting piece there that one of the reasons that you would have minutes that weren't just verbatim records of what was said is that you want people to be able to speak freely. And they might not do that. And sometimes that's for a very sensible, appropriate reason. Sometimes it's for inappropriate reasons.
Yeah.
And so there's a really interesting dynamic there of we have to think nowadays, and I'm intrigued to your thoughts on this, because we could record everything and we could use AI to summarize things.
Yeah.
But there is something about the art of not recording everything and the dynamics that can produce, both good and bad.
Totally. I mean, I think it does feel now like, I guess, what I was doing and what I had teams doing is possibly a bit of a lost art, or a one that's changing, certainly significantly. I think AI is really important, but I don't think it's quite at the level yet where summarizing is really thinking about what's the most important thing. At the risk of kind of connecting it to what I do now, I would say it's the difference between, am I giving you a recipe in a cookery book, or am I teaching it to you? Because I would argue that one of the great things about restaurant culture is kind of the thing you can go to lots of restaurants as a chef and do what's called a stage. It's basically a work experience, and you can go in and you can learn from those chefs. And I can tell you that it's such a privilege to go in and learn directly from experienced chefs, people doing different things, and learn about kind of different skills and techniques. And you just can't get that all from a book. You can get close, but you'll never kind of have the same experience as, you've been there firsthand, and you've seen it, and you've understood it. And I think, that's possibly the difference in a kind of, you've got a verbatim kind of set recording versus you've got a summary, because in the summary, someone's pointing you towards, this is the most important thing. This is the kind of emphasis. This is the takeaway, rather than just pages and pages and pages, sometimes of, a very long meeting. And I think, having more information about the ums and ahs is not necessarily helpful.
But I love that. And I love the comparison you just made. I want to explore that a little bit, because I think that's a beautiful way of one, it's, I think, drawing your worlds together. And I'm always fascinated by people that have transitioned from one thing to another and are able to see parallels that may not be obvious to other people. And so as one looks at it and goes, well, you've made a big shift. Actually, what you've pointed towards is the transferability, not necessarily of the direct skills, but actually thinking about more of the kind of dynamics that are at play, and how we like to summarize things, and how we like to sort of create almost the equivalent of the map is not the territory, right? The minutes are not the meeting. The recipe is not the dish.
Yes.
And I think that's one, it's an interesting parallel, but two, I think it's really powerful to be able to see those things and to think in those terms, because that gives you an angle, I guess, on things that one might not otherwise have. So I love that your brain is working in that way, because for me, that's when interesting things happen. We don't always need to reinvent the wheel. We need to be able to see patterns. Yeah. And I love the fact that you just jump to that. So for me, that's a sort of great way of connecting your worlds, but I think it's also demonstrative of the skill that you've got in being able to move between these worlds. Because if you were having to, I guess what you're doing is leaning on your, and that's why I'm really interested in your background as well, because you're leaning into the experiences that you've had, not in a sort of artificial CV type way where you go, and then logically, the next step I was going to do is this, because you've been driven on intuition. And so you're relying on your intuition and knowledge of a previous world to kind of help inform the one that you're in each time.
Yeah. And I think, there's a kind of nice moment about, what's that kind of moment about being in one's 40s where you're able to kind of step back a bit and think, actually, and guess it's moments like this where you stop and think, oh, actually, maybe it does make a bit more sense. And actually, these were the things that were driving me. I think, one of the things that I do think there's a really kind of direct and I would say interesting comparison between the two worlds is actually on the management side. So I think, professional kitchens are kind of one environment where you have a really clear hierarchy. Now, I think hierarchy is a bit of a divisive word, and some people like it and some people don't. And there are places it works well and places it doesn't. But I would argue that within that, there's good and bad management, and it's not necessarily the hierarchy that's the issue. And the same I would say for governance. People think automatically when I would say the word governance, that was something negative and bureaucratic. Whereas I would say, hey, it depends. There is good governance as well as bad. But certainly in a professional kitchen, I think there are some amazing lessons for an office environment and for business. I think, when you go to a restaurant, you go for a number of reasons. It might be because you like the chef that's cooking. It might be because you love the cuisine they're making. It might be because they have a particular theme. Let's say that they're a zero waste restaurant and you love the ethos behind what they do. But actually, that when you walk in the door, that restaurant is all about that theme or that purpose or that cuisine. And everyone that's working there is all working for a common goal. And I think that's something which in an office environment, people struggle with. They away days and they set visions, and then people come away and they feel a bit disconnected to it. But actually, I think in a kitchen somehow and in a restaurant, it is very natural. You wouldn't often go to a restaurant, or it wouldn't be a successful one, where you came out and you thought, oh, I don't really understand what's happening there. It's just not going to happen, or it's not going to be successful and happen. And I think, for me, people can learn some really interesting lessons about feedback. So, in a restaurant, if it goes wrong, you know about it. If you've put a hair in someone's soup, they're going to tell you that it's there. And they're going to be blunt and it's going to be obvious. Whereas again, in an office environment, I'm sure we've both experienced times where feedback is not either direct or clear, or it's behind your back, or, it's got a different agenda, but actually something powerful about set of feedback that is upfront. And you then have a choice. And I think not everyone does something with it, but, you have a choice to take action. And then I think, it's really the ultimate expression of teamwork. So for me, a really good professional kitchen, everyone has a really clear role. They've got a job description, they know what they're doing. Someone's working on sauces, someone's working on the hot plate, someone's working on desserts. And no single person in that room, in that kitchen, can deliver the meal on their own. And it's only ever going to taste good if everyone's worked together and if they are communicating, if they're clear. And I think that's just, as a kind of an impartial observer at the beginning, I found that just fascinating to go from an office environment where, sometimes all those things happen. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't all the time they weren't there, but to go somewhere where every time things were clear, people were communicating. I knew what my job was. I had my place. I felt valued and I got feedback. And that was really enlightening.
That's really, really interesting. Because if you like, and I love that framing of it, because if you ask the average person, and this is clearly not helped by those kind of Ramsay type TV shows, right? If you ask what a kitchen is like, well, they're aggressive people shouting at each other. It sort of seems like a very unpleasant place to hang out, right? And I know some of that's performative for television, but that's the impression that we get. And I've always often thought, well, hold on a minute, if people in an office behaved like how I think people in the kitchen behave, with the sort of the shouting and the run, right? That would be deemed chaos, right? If you and I were banking supervisors, right, and we saw the sorts of behaviours, and I recognizing these are extreme stereotypes, but nonetheless, right, even if you went a bit more major, you'd kind of be going, this is a bit weird here. Right? This isn't right. This isn't good. Right? Why, who's this shouty person in the corner? And yet, in that other culture, it seems acceptable.
Yeah. And look, I have worked in some unpleasant kitchens with some unpleasant chefs. So I've not been shielded from that. I don't come from the perspective that all of them are rosy. But I think there is definitely something there when it's working well, which is a kind of interesting framework. And I think that, you do absolutely get kitchens where there's unpleasantness. I think there are starting to be fewer of them as the conversation is louder about them now. And people are more willing to kind of vote with their feet. And chefs know that there are good places to work. But certainly I've worked in some amazing places where, one place I was fortunate enough to do some kind of experience with. It was a Michelin-starred place, and the chef who was in charge, he was there for every single service. There'd never been a service that happened in his restaurant when he wasn't there. And that was the extent of his dedication, that he wanted the experience to be, the right one for people that were coming every time. And he had his front of house staff ask for feedback every single course, not in a kind of irritating way, but in a conversational way to guests. And then every time that front of house staff would come into the back and communicate with the chef that had made that dish. And I can't tell you, it sounded a bit silly really, but for me, it was quite an emotional thing to be someone who, wasn't really used to getting upfront feedback often. Or, for someone to come in and say, that's the best dish I've ever eaten in my life, was quite almost a kind of unnerving thing, really. And I think, that's an amazing example. I remember telling that story many years later to a chef, and they instantly knew which restaurant it was I'd worked at where I hadn't stared, because apparently, the chef was a bit legendary for doing that. And that was his approach. And it is different. But I thought it was powerful, really, because there was nothing that made you want to work harder than that moment. There's that, random couple that you're never going to meet again who've just eaten something that you've made and they've had an amazing experience. And wow, how powerful that, you've been part of that. It felt like a really positive, nice thing.
I love this. And I'm just sort of thinking of the parallels. I mean, the amount of hours that chefs work always struck me as being unhealthily insane. And again, if I compared it back to banking, you'd sort of be going, there's a mental health crisis brewing here, or this is not good, or they're up to something, right? Why is that person working all those long hours, right? This is not sustainable. There's fraud going on, whatever, right? As you recognize there's something a bit strange, but the sort of chef's hours of getting up insanely early to go to markets and then having finished, insanely late, getting virtually no sleep, well, you're running on pure adrenaline. I mean, it's crazy as a proposition, and yet it seems to somehow work.
It is. And I think that's changed again. I guess my perspective on that would be there's no emails, Christian. And I think
Great place to be.
But for me, that was the other thing about that experience that was really freeing. People said, oh gosh, aren't you exhausted? And I said, but when I finish work, I've finished and no one's going to call me up. And I think I'd had a lot of experiences where, I might be on call at 11 o'clock and there might be an emergency, something happening, or it might be bank holiday and I might have to say to my family, oh, I'm really sorry, there's a crisis, something's happened and I need to do this. And, Christmas is slightly movable. But actually, it's something quite powerful about clocking in and really giving it your all and then clocking out. And so I would say, I don't think it's as black and white as that. I mean, chefs work incredibly hard and are very driven. And I think that does cause mental health issues. And so I wouldn't want to minimize that at all. I think that is a real issue. But there's, some great support systems out there now and a better conversation and probably better working hours and kind of stricter regulations around it. But I think I would say that there are fewer regulations around the kind of email culture, particularly where, when people are working from home, it's easier to get people all the time.
I think that's really, really interesting. And of course, you're right. It's an activity where, imagine, I don't know what there were emails, right? You can't do two things at once. Right. So it's in a way, it's a very pure form of work. Where if I look at the number of distractions that are available, good and bad, right, to people that are working in offices or doing sort of knowledge economy type jobs, where that doesn't exist in that environment, right? Because if you're not paying attention, you're cutting yourself, burning the food, right? Things are not going according to plan. So you have to be 100% in the moment. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's it. There's no opportunity for kind of a thought experiment in the middle of the day, or a coffee with your friend. It is really intense, and it is hard work. But I think that's why it's about picking a kitchen that you love. For me, when I did some restaurant work, it was about finding a leader, finding a kind of head chef that inspired me. So finding someone who was different. So the chef I was talking about just before, he's a self-taught chef, and I think to be Michelin-starred and be a self-taught chef is an impressive thing. He was just utterly dedicated to this is what he wanted to do. He didn't go to culinary school. And at that point, I hadn't been to culinary school, and I wanted to find people who were different. And actually, eventually found out that Raymond Blanc hadn't even been to culinary school. And there's not many people in the world that will tell you that he's not a chef. And so, I wanted to find people who could tell me that I could still be legitimate, even if I hadn't had that experience. I have since been to culinary school, and I'm really glad I did. And it was really valuable. But I think it was useful to kind of have a diversity of experience with kind of male and female head chefs as well, to see how their management style was different and what their approach was.
I love that. That's a really interesting observation there around effectively, that's a really good example of if you can't see it, I can't remember, you can't be it was the phrase, I think, but it's totally, in other words, you need role models that have done a similar thing. And I love this idea of if you're going to shift and pivot to do different things or unconventional paths to things, you need other role models who've done that unconventional path. Otherwise, it looks like a closed shop. And I think that's a really, really interesting observation. And it's got nothing to do with your abilities. It's just that you need those people to be there. So that's an illustration. I think I thought about it in the context of equality and diversity and these sorts of things, but I'd never thought about it in the context of sort of making unusual moves. You need those trailblazers to give you, not to tell you that you can do it, but to give you the confidence and a little bit of a sense of where the path is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I got my first kind of paid restaurant job when I was in my mid-30s. And I had a kind of mad time where I did the day job, finished the day job, and then clocked on, it's like 7 o'clock at night for an evening shift till 1 a.m. in the morning in a restaurant, because I was that keen to see was the right thing for me. And I was super driven, and I did it for about 3 or 4 months, and it was a great experience. But when I went in and I had an interview with the head chef, I sort of said my background and everything else. And he said, you're going to find it tough as a woman and as an older woman. And he, didn't mince his words about it. But he said, well, your science background really means the only thing you can be is a pastry chef, because cooking is an art and it's not a science. And so, your science means that you'll really only make it as a pastry chef. And at that point, I was so, he was someone who, was a reasonable deal at the time. And I thought, gosh, he must be right, because I hadn't had that conversation with anyone else. And I thought, oh, right, okay. I mean, I love, pastry work, and, that's great. And I like baking and things. Maybe that is the right thing, but actually that's rubbish. And I think, really, I didn't have the confidence then to either know or say that was rubbish, and it wouldn't have got me the job. Look, if I had, but the reality is that, and the principle behind what I do now and the kind of science in kind of having a cookery lab, it's not so much a gimmick. It's more about saying that food is a science. You only need to look at the Maillard reaction, for example, which is, a chemical process people would kind of associate with a good sear on their steak, for example, or the right roast on their coffee beans. That significantly impacts the flavor, the aroma and the color, of the foods that we all enjoy. And I think, it's foolish to say that cooking is an art. And there are lots of big chefs who are insistent. But I would say that science doesn't have to make it something hard or something boring. It's just about saying there's a reason why something's happening. So you're kind of changing the temperature of something, or you're cutting something in a particular way, and there's a reason why. And if you do it that same way, you will get the same result every time. And that's why you can't tell people, oh, boil an egg for this number of minutes, and it will always be the same, because your egg will be a different size sometimes, right? So you can't boil an ostrich egg for the same length as a quail's egg, right? And so I think it's that if you understand what you need to happen in the cookery process, then you're a bit free of it. You don't have to worry, oh gosh, I've forgotten, what did that recipe say? But it's much more, okay, I understand. I just need to make sure I cook it until this happens. And then I know it's going to be okay to eat, or I know it's going to be delicious.
I think that's brilliant. And I love this idea of clearly there's an art form. I don't know, the way you plate things, for example.
Totally.
There's a,
Yeah.
so there's a sort of this, and that's not just a presentational thing, right? There will be, but it's almost like you're talking about. You need to understand the science. If one were to draw this distinction, I recognise the flaws in that. You'd sort of be saying you need to understand the science to be able to do the bits that are art.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or to do them well. Look, people doing amazing plating. I'm the first person to say, I love plating a dish, but am I much better if I've been inspired by someone or someone has told me what to do? So I love it in a restaurant where you're in the kind of kitchen and you're one of the kind of worker bees and the head chef says, plate it like this. For me, that's like gold dust. It's like, I like following the rules. I know it's got to be a good rule, right? Rather than a bad rule. But I love following the rules. I love almost the relaxation that comes from knowing that if I follow these rules, it will be right. And for me, that's quite freeing. And I think, I'm not ashamed to admit that I would never be a kind of master chef of plating. I don't have that kind of amazing imagination in terms of people's artistic streaks, but would I love to execute it for someone else to make it beautiful in the way they envision it? For sure. I'm more of a helper than I am of a leader, I think.
That's really interesting because I always had this thing that I don't like being told what to do, all this kind of stuff. And what I've discovered, and I've always known this, right? But I've discovered it recently because it sort of occurred to me is, like, I love Lego. And so I am perfectly willing to go and buy a Lego model and recognizing that when I was a kid, right, Lego was, you built the thing and then you did other stuff with it, right? So there was this creative tool. But nowadays, if you go out and buy those Lego kits, most of the ones available in the store, it's basically you're just following someone else's instructions.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting because I'm like, if you ask me, am I the sort of person that would slavishly follow instructions? The answer would be no, right? I'm going to find ways, but I will, in the context of Lego, I will go and spend a ton of money because these things are not cheap, right? But I will do exactly what I'm told, and I'll be really pissed off if I don't quite follow it. If I get it wrong, I have to go back, and I'll take steps back in the more complicated ones where I realize I've got it slightly wrong. But I will sit there and I will obediently follow rules that somebody else has laid out. And I just thought, that's really interesting. So as you were talking about cooking, I was like, well, I would like to believe that I would be a sort of swashbuckling, do whatever chef, but I perfectly would, given I do that with Lego, right? There's no reason why. And I think that's a really interesting illustration of it doesn't have to be, both of those things, like slavishly following rules, just following somebody else's. IKEA furniture, actually, to a certain extent as well, right? It's just structured. And so I think there's something interesting there that is, it sounds a bit soul-destroying and pointless, but I think if the context in which you're doing it delivers something that is joyous, then we can all undergo horrible experiences, or things that could be not horrible in that moment, but things that could, in another context, be awful.
Yeah,
that I wouldn't necessarily wish to do. And I think that's a neat way of looking at it and thinking, actually, and maybe this is the point within cooking, you've got this range of things, which is there is going to be some, to produce those delightful things, the Instagrammable moments, the incredible culinary experiences, right, where the food tastes incredible and looks amazing, and I'm wowed by the way, right, requires, on the one hand, that creative vision to make that happen. On the other hand, there's a ton of people, right, and the more complex it is, the more clearly the number of people goes up, right? You need people that are just going to slavishly follow that to the letter, to follow this stuff and do those things. And I think there's a really interesting contrast there.
But there is, but there's also something magical that happens behind the scenes in that, Christian, where you have these brigades of people who are kind of following the rules. But the best chefs, then what they do is they're very clever. They inspire even the most junior in their brigades to say, what would you do? Why don't you, over the next couple of months, design a dish and present it to me? Have this day, don't be working for me on that day, work on your dish and present it to me and pitch it to me and tell me why and what. And I think there are those moments, much like the 10-year-old Sarah project I was telling you about, where someone's kind of trying to ignite a spark in someone to say, one day you might be kind of leading the kitchen and you need to be doing this. And actually it's a great opportunity to learn. And why don't you start to think about not just doing what you're supposed to be doing here, but thinking in the background, if this was my restaurant, what dish would I have? And I think there are some, amazing stories that chefs tell about, their dish being chosen to be kind of on the menu. And I think, that must be an amazing feeling to be someone junior in the kitchen, to have designed something and then suddenly see, wow, the rest of the kitchen is cooking my dish. And I think that's really smart management, where you're not afraid as a manager to allow your team to shine. And I think for me, that was the moment in the office where I suddenly loved management, when I had a great team of people. I mean, there were points in my career where I've had just some people who were just brilliant, and I felt privileged every day to go to work kind of with. And they would do things, and I would be able to step back and say, this is you and this is your moment. And there's nothing nicer than, now I see them on LinkedIn and they're 100 times more senior than I ever was. And I think, gosh, how amazing to have had a moment where we all work together and you're able to provide a place for people to shine and be their best, really.
Love that. Now, you've talked about all these experiences. How does all of this then come together in what you're doing now?
I made it sound quite random, haven't I?
No. Because I think like if we were to use a culinary thing, clearly there is something amazing that comes out at the end of this process. But we've seen the sort of constituent parts of the recipe, of the ingredients. What I loved about it is you've linked all the things together, and we can sort of see where we're going. And I'm now intrigued as to, I guess, give us the sense of the recipe. Maybe that's the way to look at it.
So I think it was just, I got to a point where I thought, gosh, so by this stage, had lots of kind of experience in restaurants, then did a kind of 3-month kind of career break stint moment in culinary school, went to Leiths and had an amazing time, albeit it was kind of the summer of 2020, which was a strange time to be kind of wearing a mask and in culinary school. But, all credit to them. They ran an amazing course in difficult circumstances. And then I went back to kind of corporate world for a bit and thought, oh gosh, it's COVID. It's not a good time to be in a restaurant. And then I guess the honest answer is something happened there where I met my now husband, and that wasn't something I was expecting. And the honest truth is, he inspired me to where I am now. So he runs an amazing business. He's had a business for about 18 years, teaching kind of technology to kids. He runs week-long camps, teaching them to kind of build robots or design things with 3D printers and fly drones and all of these amazing things. And there was lots of talk, as there is in a relationship, all about, how did he get to where he has, and all the different ways his business has evolved over time. And, lots of conversations, between us about what did I want to do. And then he got me this amazing opportunity with a school that he used to teach at. I went in to teach cookery there as a kind of activity, and it was just brilliant. It was kind of everything I kind of wanted it to be and more, and the children loved it. The only really difficult thing was my poor, as he was partner at the time, was having to fill his enormous kind of people carrier full of mobile induction hobs and pots and pans, and I have a tiny mini, so it was never going to fit in my car. And it was so much work to transport. They had no kitchen, transport everything that was needed. And I just thought, gosh, it's not very sustainable to pop up in a location, and it takes sort of an hour to set up and then 3 hours to clean
Right.
up. And that was the moment where I thought, actually, I need a place. And we sort of embarked on a bit of a journey together, thinking about, he had a rented office, and we sort of thought about, what things could we do together? How could we kind of run our businesses together, or, how could we co-locate in a space? And we looked at everything from kind of old hotels to old pubs to a disused car garage. And then eventually we found a pair of industrial units, kind of neighbouring industrial units. And we, took a plunge and, each bought an industrial unit. And then I was very lucky that he basically gave up many, many hours of his time to help me kind of entirely fit out. So we did it almost entirely ourselves, apart from the electrics, to take a kind of blank industrial unit to kind of now a kind of fully working kind of modern teaching kitchen, and, complete with me single-handedly putting in a suspended ceiling and all sorts of crazy
Wow.
skills. But I kind of conclude at the end of the process that, it can't be that bad. As partway through, he asked me to marry him, and I think, really, I guess having someone who I suppose really believed in me and supported me was really the ultimate push that I needed. I think it's hard to kind of do something different. And I suppose, brave doesn't sound like the right word, but, to be bold maybe is a better one. And he was there through the moments of complete self-doubt to utter joy. The first time that someone books a class and you just think, oh, this is amazing. It's finally happening. Great to be able to share it with him, really, I guess I would say.
Love this. And so give us a sense of, you said booked a class. What sort of things can people do? How does that work?
So all sorts of things, I think, is the honest answer. I guess it ranges right now from lots of holiday classes for children and young people. So lots of kind of cooking for 8 to 16-year-olds. Some really lovely classes with kind of parent and child, not necessarily. I've had some grown-up children, inverted commas, some sort of 20-somethings have come with their mum. I did a really nice Mother's Day class where they came and made afternoon teas together, just as a way of having that shared experience and doing something together rather than a sort of more traditional, here's a bunch of flowers. And then, the thing I'm working on at the moment is some interesting kind of corporate group options. So some kind of away days, really thinking about what I was saying about how you can learn some interesting lessons about management and about teamwork from kind of working together in the kitchen. I think, there's lots of options that kind of other cookery schools do where you create a meal together or you do a bake-off and all those things are available. But I'm also quite interested in how I can kind of leverage the technology connection with my husband's business. So we're currently working on a workshop for people to kind of create their own chocolate bar. So
Oh, wow.
what's the actual chocolate to what's the filling, to designing and printing the packaging. Are you making a salt and vinegar crisps with a caramel, or is it a wasabi and a marshmallow? And what would you then do to entice someone to pick up your bar? And then you kind of leave at the end of the day with your own kind of unique chocolate bar, really. And so it's about, for me, I guess, creating experiences for people to come out of the office and do something that's a bit different, where underneath it there's a level of meaning. I think I always used to, when I was running a team, work hard to find away days that people might enjoy. But I suppose as the manager, I was thinking in the background, I want something where different people can excel. Sometimes in a team it's a bit boring when the same person is successful. And so I used to look for, what do I think some people might not be as good at and others might really have an opportunity to shine, and the rest of the team might see them in a different light. And I think these kind of experiences are certainly ones where you can't really predict, who'll make the most delicious chocolate bar and, who will kind of enjoy it and come to the fore. And I think that's quite exciting to be able to say, this can be an experience that's an expression of yourself, or a kind of way of working together differently as a group, or just even something where in the age of kind of working from home, people are able to come together and connect. In the office, there was this really interesting report. I think it's the kind of World Happiness Report that came out quite recently, a couple of months ago. And for the first time, they looked at the impact of sharing meals with others and how sharing meals supports happiness and social connection. And actually, an extraordinary piece of data which said that if you live in either North America, Australia, or New Zealand, and you always dine alone, if you made the change to share 8 or more of your meals a week, so that will be the equivalent of lunch and dinner on 4 days a week, the well-being benefit is the equivalent to doubling your income, which just blew my mind. The idea that people report such a significant increase in well-being just through the act of sharing a meal and not being alone for that would have that effect of double your income, I thought was just a mind-blowing statistic.
Wow. What a great positive note on which to end. As I knew would happen, Sarah, time has just flown, and it's been lovely to catch up with you and hear like amazing stories I'd never heard before, but pulling it all together, you clearly are doing something you absolutely love. And it just comes through just from the way you talk about it, the story that got you there, all of those things. There's just this raw passion, enthusiasm. You have found your vocation, which is just such a delight to come across. But so that people can enjoy that, tell them how they can find you. I'll put links in the show notes, obviously, but tell people how can they find you?
Thank you. So it's called the Cookery Lab, LAB, in a place called Aldermaston. I'm just outside Reading. So kind of actually very well connected from a public transport perspective, but in a slightly more kind of rural space. So if you're looking for a bit of a trip out, then that's where we are, just in Aldermaston outside Reading. And I'm really kind of open 7 days a week. So really available for people to pop down during the week, in the evenings or at the weekends. So it would certainly be great to see some teams in here kind of having a go at different things.
Amazing. Listen, thank you so much. It's just been an absolute joy talking to you. I love what you're doing. I love the way you're going about doing it. And I've loved hearing your story. So thank you, one, for what you do, because it's brilliant. It sounds great. But the second thing is, thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course to Sarah for appearing. To find out more about Sarah and the Cookery Lab, including how you can book sessions and learn more about her story, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed this episode, do consider leaving a review. It really helps other people to find the show. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them now, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay curious, maybe take a moment to explore how the rules you follow in one part of your life could inspire creativity in another. But above all, thank you so much for listening.